Genesis of the Daleks saw the end of the mini-Dalek mania that had begun with Day of the Daleks. After 4 consecutive years of an appearance every season, another 5 years would pass until the Daleks returned again in this story. The Tom Baker era as a whole generally tended to be quite reluctant to use returning villains. In the 5 years that passed between Genesis and this story, Destiny of the Daleks, the Cybermen, Sontarans and Master returned only once each, and they were the only ones who did return. The preference in the Hinchcliffe era to go with new enemies was pretty obvious, and how iconic many of those new enemies have become is the testament to the success in that strategy. During the Hinchcliffe era, Doctor Who was at its creative peak while the Daleks were nowhere to be seen, and while the Graham Williams era was not as good and had its problems to be sure, one thing you could never accuse it of was a lack of imagination and storytelling ideas. The simple fact seemed to be that Doctor Who simply didn't need the Daleks. The process that had begun with Evil in extracting the Daleks from the DNA of the show's success was complete. But they weren't going to stay away forever, and it would be the start of Doctor Who's 17th season that they'd return. Season 17 is an odd one. It has its fans, to be sure, and you'd never describe it as charmless or unlikable like I would, say, Season 24 or much of New Who, but ultimately the buck stops with the quality of the stories, and bar the magnificent City of Death, it's mostly cack. I mean, cack you can enjoy and have fun with.
My dreams of conquest!
Etc. and so forth, but cack nonetheless. This story fits oddly, as being a million miles away from the quality of City of Death, but not quite as lowly regarded as the rest of the season. I don't think it's good, but I'd be lying if I said I thought it was actually bad. Its flaws come from it being oddly constructed and bizarre in places, and giving a strange and unique vibe, and unfortunately this turns the story into being kind of a bit dull, but we'll get to the details in a bit. I'd say there are two major mistakes that were made with the story that doomed it from day one, although obviously there were others, and we'll go into those in detail, because it'd be a pretty short video otherwise. First was having Terry Nation come back to write it. And yes, I'm aware Nation had first refusal on writing Dalek stories, so when he said yes they didn't have much choice, but Nation had clearly been bored of the Daleks for a long time, and the dirge he wrote during the Pertwee era was a sign of that if it was ever needed. Genesis gave him an idea that captivated him and one he really put his passion into. Expecting lightning to strike twice in that regard was probably not something to bet on. While this is a better script than either of the Pertwee stories, and does show a few ideas he seems to be interested in, they undermine themselves by being bizarre and out of place, and in other means, his usual foibles are very much present and do the story no favours. Like Genesis, it has been speculated the script editor rewrote much of the story, of course, and while that story benefited from Robert Holmes' knack for intelligent plotting and character work, Destiny seems to suffer from Douglas Adams' comedy. It can be sometimes funny comedy, granted, but it feels out of place and further contributes to the story's very odd feel and tone. The second mistake was bringing back Davros. Why they chose to do this, I've got no idea, as his story and arc was completed in Genesis, and no matter what they did, this was going to feel like it was digging up the past for the sake of it. It means the story detracts from the Daleks themselves, and whatever merit some of the plot might have, ultimately the character dynamics feel like a pale retread of Genesis, and it leaves the story feeling empty and like it didn't really need to happen. Combined with the well-known production difficulties surrounding the character, the outcome is not exactly impressive. Destiny of the Daleks is therefore an odd confluence of several different factors that were fairly unique to this period in the show's history, and it makes for odd viewing as a result. Let's dive a little deeper into why. Starting with the production, this story was directed by Ken Grieve, whose sole Doctor Who credit is this story. His work here is odd, I think is how I'd describe it. The short version is that Grieve was clearly attempting to add a bit of dynamism to what at times can be a very plodding and pedestrian script, and sometimes it works. The use of tracking shots, pullbacks, reveal shots sees out a bit to otherwise dull scenes. On the other hand, they can sometimes just be odd and distracting. To select one obvious example, the notoriously bad first cliffhanger of the story is pretty poor on paper, but it isn't helped by some very odd cutting around and editing that does the opposite of building atmosphere and just makes it seem more silly when the Daleks crash in. In fact, the setup to that scene is even more bizarre. When Romana falls down the shaft, there's like an action replay moment where we see it from several angles, which is a start of place out of nowhere. It's almost endearing in how silly it looks. Almost. I do appreciate that this feels very different from what you typically get from the direction in this era, and a more creative approach is always welcome over the film stage play approach, but I think Grieve takes it a bit too far throughout most of the story. I get the script he was working with was not exactly action-packed and briskly paced, but nevertheless the end result can also sometimes be quite dull, which is usually the only other thing that manages other than odd. But as I said, there are some scenes where the dynamism works in its favour, so it's difficult to say what the overall effect is. Another choice he makes, presumably it was his choice anyway, was to reduce the amount of music to a bare minimum, which is a plus and a minus. It can help with the atmosphere sometimes, giving a sense of dread and helping you get across a sense of bleakness, but then it can also contribute to how dull it feels, so swings and roundabouts. Anyway, overall I'd say it's an odd directing job, but not necessarily a good or bad one. Other elements of the production don't impress too much. Skaro looks pretty bad. For the first time, it's just a BBC quarry, which is a huge step down from how the location looked in Genesis. The feeling of this scarred wasteland of a planet from that story, or even the creepy otherworldliness from the first Dalek story, that's all gone, and it's just another planet of the week. Granted, the script doesn't help, but it feels just lifeless and generic as a location shoot. The rest of the production design also isn't great. Both the Dalek sets and the Movellan spaceship just feel generic. We also can't forget how silly the Movellans look, can we? I mean, go for androgynous representation in 1979, I suppose, but I'm going to take a wild stab in the dark and say that wasn't the intent, and that they just look ridiculous. Apparently they were modelled on ancient Egyptians, to which I can only say, why? And why did said modelling end up with them looking like that? It's a bit difficult to take them seriously as the mortal enemies of the Daleks. Speaking of which, for Daleks. It's fair to say I don't think they've looked brilliant at any point during the 70s, and I'm just not a fan of the dark grey gunmetal look in general. But the years since they were last used have not done the Dalek props any favours, and they look really tired and worn out. It doesn't help how weak the Daleks seem to be in this story overall, by looking like they're only fit for the tip. The Daleks in the 60s seemed elegant and menacing as a result. The Daleks throughout most of the 70s have wobbled and trundled their way around, and here is about the worst it gets. What's baffling is that a bit of money was actually available, but instead of just making a few new props to be in the main Daleks, they instead built a bunch of wooden/fiberglass ones to increase the number of Daleks available for use. Which in theory might make sense, and indeed the size of the Dalek army we see going for the suicide run against the Movellan ship has a kind of scale we haven't seen before, but in practice the wooden ones just look fake as hell, because they can't move properly, and just sit in the background looking lifeless at best, and, well, when they're moving, and less said the better. It adds to the feeling of the Daleks less being a powerful race that can conquer the galaxy and exterminate all in their way, and more to them being a bunch of easily defeatable wobbling dustbins. The script does most of the work, but how they are on screen does the rest. Finally, the music. As I said, it's pretty limited in this story. Which is good, because most of what we do get is crap. It's amusing that Dudley Simpson does his absolute very best work in the next story along, because this might be his absolute worst. When it's not his usual generic horns, we get some of the most bizarrely out of place music ever put in a Doctor Who story.
You will release me. You will return me to the Daleks.
Shut up or I'll switch you off.
I don't even know how I'd describe that music other than bad, I suppose, but what on earth was the aim here? Whatever it was, it didn't work. So perhaps the limited music was mostly Ken Grieve trying to avoid having anything like that over most of it. Well, with the production out of the way, time for the script. As I said, like Genesis, there is a question over whose work this really is. Terry Nation is obviously the credited writer, but script editor Douglas Adams is said to have done a lot of work on the scripts. On the one hand, it is quintessential Nation, with the confused plotting, weak dialogue, and constant wandering around and expositing, and well, it does show some of his positive qualities too, like world building and thematic work, but they are significantly blunted by how obvious it is just to watch the damn thing that he was not particularly enthusiastic about it, and it showed. On the other though, Adams' fingerprints are all over it, some decent comedy but a general feeling of mismatched tone and loose plotting. Adams was a comedic genius, there's no question there, and that genius did bring a City of Death, but his skills as a script editor maybe left something to be desired, and I think that may well be on show here. There's a lack of polish and focus that was a recurring theme throughout this season. Regardless of who was the main cook in the kitchen here, and who indeed wrote the most brilliant insult of all time,
Now back off!
we have to actually look at the content of the story, and I'll try and attribute who did what as we go along when I can, but it'll be purely guesswork. So, no different from most of the time for me, eh? I'll give the story this. I think the central idea is not a bad one. Exploring logic and mathematics is something a bit different, and I think the ideas and message are simple enough to be got across to the audience while avoiding being simplistic enough to be stupid. The rock, paper, scissors stuff is a bit of a brainwave in achieving this, and actually results in some of the funnier jokes of the story, while also getting across its message in a good way. The futility of pure logic and its application and how it can be defeated. It's a nice point to start with for a few reasons, and some of them work, the Doctor's character for instance, but we'll get to that a bit later. Mostly though it works because it's an uncomplicated but interesting idea that's presented in a way that the audience can easily get while appreciating the ideas. It doesn't outright tell us, but the way it's woven into the dialogue and presentation nevertheless make it clear. The idea of chaos being the solution is a nice passage that plays into what Doctor Who is about, and as I said, does some nice character things of the Doctor that we'll look at. The problem is in the application of this story, because it's based on a false premise and one that seems extremely bizarre given where the Daleks started, created by, oh yes, the writer of this story. Daleks aren't logical creatures. I mean, they can be guided by logic, it's not out of the question, but they're primarily guided by their emotions, namely anger and hatred. This was pretty obvious in the first story, where it was their dislike for the unlike that guided them, which Ian describes as stupid and ridiculous, but what fit, and that's how they've been portrayed ever since. A burning hatred for everything different that results in a campaign of extermination across the universe is not what I would describe as logical, given the usage of resources involved and all that. And yet the Daleks do it anyway, because that's what they are. Remember in Genesis, where we find out that the Davros programmed these ideas into them at the genetic level, or whatever it was. I forget the precise technobabble, but you know what I mean. And that was the deciding factor in the Daleks turning against them at the end. Remember, that particular story was written by, oh yes, this numbnut, so the discrepancy makes absolutely no sense. The Daleks decree,
self-sacrifice illogical, therefore impossible.
but the reason they should think that is that no Dalek would ever self-sacrifice, being superior beings and all, not weird shoehorned ideas about logic. Now, if this was the Cybermen, it would make perfect sense. Their lack of emotion and reliance on logic is core to what they are, as much as the anger and hatred are to the Daleks. If they were locked in a war with the Movellans, I'd completely believe they would end up stalemated because of the perfect logic. But if we go with what we see in this story, the Daleks should have won a long time ago, because the moment their battle computer told them anything other than exterminate them all, they would have got pissed off and told their battle computer where to shove it, thus overcoming the Movellans' logic and winning. What makes this worse is that the Movellans actually represent this really well. The absurd looks aside, they do a really good job of showing what pure logic looks like. They're cold and unemotional, guided entirely by the mission and without regard, but there's no malice or hatred to it either. A bit I like that shows this is the resolution to the cliffhanger at the start of Part 4, where the Doctor rather abruptly fails to save Romana from the big MacGuffin bomb, but then the bomb doesn't go off. One of the Movellans announced they didn't bother activating it because all they needed was to draw the Doctor out. Actually detonating it would have been a waste. They're not interested in killing for killing's sake, again, cold logic but without malice, which provides a clear contrast to the Daleks who would just let it go off to kill them because that's who they are. But they also show the folly of pure logic too. They're constantly outwitted by the Doctor who use imagination and cunning in a way that they are incapable. And in the end they're defeated by the ragtag bunch of prisoners, who are angry and desperate, again motivations that escape the Movellans. I'm not saying the Movellans are perfect, their backstory could use a lot more fleshing out and the motivations are sometimes a bit weak, but I think they display this logic idea very well. Movellans are of course robots. The idea of this race of robots who presumably look after themselves without any organic intervention is an interesting one that goes entirely unexplored, as I said, but never mind. The point I'm actually trying to make here is that they are another race of robots, because, well, the story seems to very heavily imply, if not outright state, that the Daleks appear to have lost their organic parts and are now entirely artificial life forms. The Doctor finds a car-led mutant just lying around, like it fell out of someone's shopping bag, and comments that they used to be organic life. This is just bizarre. Apart from anything else, it reinforces how the Daleks are a square peg being put into a round hole here, in that something completely core to them, that they are cyborgs and not robots, is apparently being abandoned. But it truly seems weird to me because, what's the angle here? Terry Nation is their creator, who knew better than anyone else what the Daleks were, because it was him who thought the fucking things up in the first place, so this must have been an intentional choice and not some mistake. I mean, maybe Douglas Adams added those bits, and he was obviously new as script editor, but he'd written for the show before. I find it difficult to believe that he was unfamiliar enough with the Daleks to do that, and also that he thought this was an angle worth exploring, so why? If this is being done as a deliberate choice, what are you doing with it? What are you exploring? What changes are you planning to bring? Because I want the Daleks to better fit the theme I'm going for is not good enough. If you want to do such a huge change to what they are, it needs more exploring, more explaining, and a better reason than because. It's just such a baffling out-of-nowhere change. Probably a good time to speak about the Daleks themselves, actually, and we have unfortunately gone back to the weak, useless Daleks after how good they seemed in Genesis. The on-screen screen issues I mentioned earlier don't help, of course, but here Nations manages the double whammy of making them both absurd and useless. Absurd in how they are presented, wobbling along going, "Do not deviate," which is just funny and in how unauthoritative they sound. The Part 1 cliffhanger is infamous for them bursting in and endlessly telling Romana not to move while she stays perfectly still and doesn't move at all. And of course, one Dalek gets defeated by a hat. Yes, a Dalek panicking and screaming about its impaired vision because of a hat on its eye stalk. This also plays into the uselessness angle, because if the Daleks are so easily defeated, then why should we take them remotely seriously as villains? As long as you have a spare object handy to lob onto the eye stalk, don't remotely worry about them, you'll be fine. Can you imagine throwing clothing items at the Daleks in Power or Genesis? Of course not, they'd blast you down before you even work out whether overarm or underarm would be better for the throw. And here, well, they don't manage that at all, do they? Unfortunately, this does have Douglas Adams' fingerprints all over it, and while he was a comedic genius and much of his work on Doctor Who could be wickedly funny, this is just painful and a very bad tonal mismatch. The Daleks, of course, are also foiled by weak comedy at other times. This one's pretty infamous.
If you're supposed to be the superior race of the universe, why don't you try climbing after us? Bye-bye!
Yes, that's how you make a villain threatening, draw attention to their weaknesses in a way that seems we're only one step away from the Dalek shaking its fist and going, "I would have got away with it too if it wasn't for you damn kids." Doesn't have a fist, but you get the idea. There's of course also the usual pathetic Dalek stuff. They're easily outsmarted and easily destroyed and defeated, blah blah blah. I'm not going to go into details of this because I'm going to be saying it a lot over the rest of the classic era, let's be honest, but to choose a few examples, you'd have thought a bunch of malnourished, desperate prisoners wouldn't be much of a match for the Daleks, but apparently not. And yes, I know it said it made sense that they defeated Movellans, and it did, but that was through cunning rather than just rushing at them. I can't quite say this is the weakest they've ever been, because Death to the Daleks still exists, but is pretty close. Of course, the Daleks' objective in this story is to find their creator, and it looks like it's time to talk about Davros, isn't it? Oh god. Davros shouldn't be in this. I'm not saying the character never ever had to return after Genesis, but it should not have been anything like this soon, and not for a reason this feeble. I don't even necessarily mind the idea of why, the Daleks deciding Davros is their best bet at breaking this logical deadlock, but because of how screwy the logical stuff is for the Daleks anyway, it feels like it's a bit shoehorned in to reach this precise outcome, and that makes Davros' return feel even cheaper. His arc had a perfect conclusion in Genesis, and any attempt to continue it would have felt like not leaving enough alone, unless this was later and felt like it had a more solid reason than this, and well, this was too early and did not have enough of a solid reason. I think you get the idea there. Of course, the production difficulties with Davros in the story are well known. Michael Wisher was not available to return, so David Goodison had to step in. The mask didn't fit Goodison properly, and years of being shoved in a drawer somewhere clearly had not done it much good, and he looks tired and tatty as a result. I don't blame Goodison for this, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who thinks any of this is his fault, but his performance is not even a scratch on Wisher's, and the lack of electronic modulation in the voice makes the performance just sound cheap. But that's all minor stuff compared to how badly he's misused in the script. Davros works best as a character, as we'll see in future stories, when his relationship with the Doctor is the centre of proceedings. Otherwise, mediocre or poor stories are lifted by the strength of the interactions between these two, because they make a very good contrast. They're both scientists, both independent thinkers, both free thinkers, and both convinced that they're doing right. But their methods, the ideas, and well, the fact that Davros is an insane maniac who's definitely not doing right, are where the conflict lies. We saw this in Genesis, the Doctor posing the question of the virus and Davros letting the mask slip showed a difference, but the Doctor posed a deliberately abhorrent idea and Davros went for it anyway. And yet the contrast with the Doctor's desperation to complete his mission shows how they were in many ways different sides of the same coin. The relationship they have in this story is beyond the pale shadow of that. There's a twinge of hope when Davros is first revealed, the Doctor lamenting,
"He created the Daleks."
Yes. I could have stopped him.
I like this line. It says so much in just a few words, the Doctor regretting some of the choices he made in Genesis that, if done differently, could have destroyed the Daleks forever, and seeing Davros again as being reminded of that failure. But that's about all we get. The rest of it is either just generic hero-villain discussion, or ridiculous crap about the Doctor pushing him around and threatening to switch him off, which, if you remember, would kill him, but never mind. The scenes where the Doctor is hiding Davros from the Daleks are a perfect indication of this. On the surface, it's fine. The dialogue is actually very witty and well written, clearly an Adams edition rather than anything Nation could do. Baker's performance has its usual complexities and subtleties to try and convey more. But the problem is there's just no depth. It's generic, I'm the good guy, I'm the bad guy conversations, with nothing to explore both their relationship in the previous story or their own similarities and differences. Imagine you're Davros, having been exterminated by your own creations and finally waking up for some reason. I'm not sure it's ever actually explained why he finally wakes up. Anyway, finally waking up, and the first face you see is the Doctor. The personification of his failure from last time, a constant thorn in his side and yet an intellectual equal. And he seems a bit miffed about it, not much more. His reaction to the Doctor throughout most of the story is dull irritance. And again, the Doctor had so much to explore about what went wrong for him in the last story, and introduced the quips and telling Davros that he'll stop his naughty plans. Davros just goes on and on about he's going to rule the universe and dominate the Daleks, and frankly his megalomania was always the least interesting aspect of him, but there's nothing more to him in this story. What emotions do you think the death of the end of Genesis might bring up? Bitterness, anger at the Daleks, a sense of failure for allowing himself to be so blinded, arrogance that despite that he survived, showing he's more powerful than the Daleks? Well, you don't get to see any of that here, not an iota of it is explored. He struts around as all megalomaniac, and that's all that's explored is trying to help the Daleks escape their logical trap, through a very stupid plan, and then the story bizarrely decides to demonstrate he's also two traps in logic.
All elephants are pink. Nelly is an elephant. Therefore, Nelly is pink. Logical?
Perfectly.
You know what a human would say to that?
What?
Elephants aren't pink.
Humans do not understand logic.
So he wouldn't have been able to help the Daleks much anyway. And since when was that logical and not steeped in a... whatever. You might have noticed I've mentioned the Genesis a lot when it comes to Davros, and perhaps you might be saying it's unfair to compare one of the greatest stories of all time to this one. I'd say two things to that. Firstly, stop talking to your PC or phone. It's pre-recorded, I can't actually answer your questions unless I guess correctly what you're asking like I have here. You just got lucky, you won't get anywhere just talking to the video like that. Secondly, and perhaps a bit more seriously, I'm making those comparisons because it's impossible not to. This is a character returning from that story, his arc leading directly on from the end of that story, and facing exactly the same Doctor from that story. What do you want me to do? If Nation didn't want me to draw comparisons with that story, maybe you shouldn't link so bloody blatantly to it, because it makes the flaws of this story's presentation of Davros all the more obvious through the comparison. So what else is this story? Well, the Doctor's character is handled reasonably well. Unlike in Genesis, where the Fourth Doctor was still being established, here he was very much a known quantity. Funny, sometimes childish, witty, but with a deep sense of seriousness that would rise up whenever it needed to. Destiny hardly breaks new ground, but it does well with a few key moments, such as when the Movellans first reveal they're on Skaro, the silliness routine he had been going with suddenly drops, and Baker portrays it so effortlessly with just a few words and facial changes. I've already mentioned the scene where he first sees Davros, of course, but it shows a similar thing, how the facade can drop oh so briefly. The main thrust of the Doctor's character in the story is his relationship to the logic stuff, and how he is the antithesis of logic. This is reflected in his behaviours and actions, and sometimes it can be a negative him and show his weaknesses. For instance, the Daleks exploit his total inability to watch innocent people die by exterminating the prisoners to get him to capitulate. Logically, he held all the cards in holding Davros, but his compassion, however illogical, defeated him. But we also see how his imagination, creativity and fearlessness allow him to succeed, well demonstrated as he dominates the Movellans in the manly sport of rock, paper, scissors. The Movellans want to kidnap him to use him as their logic breaker, and it's easy to see why. This is why I think much of the logic stuff does work, because it's very much in keeping with the spirit of the character in the series that imagination defeats cold logic. Baker is excellent as always. I think this is a good outing for the Fourth Doctor. Then there's his companion. This is the opportune time to discuss the elephant in the room. The opening scene is one of the most breathtakingly bizarre scenes in the show's history. It really needs to be seen to be believed. See, at the end of the previous season, Mary Tam had left the series. Obviously, had a unique opportunity of a Time Lord companion, they decided to regenerate her, hiring Lalla Ward, who played Princess Astra in the last story of the previous season. Now, admittedly, Adams, who 100% certainly wrote this scene, as Nation had no interest in doing so, was stuck here, as the opportunities to create an actual reason for the regeneration were extremely limited, unless they were going to convince Tam to do a full story, and that seemed unlikely. So it was always going to be a bit of a bodge job, and we saw with the Doctor in Time and the Rani how pathetic such a bodge job could end up being. Now, whether the answer to avoid that was create something so totally batshit insane is an open question, but is very much what we got. I'll be honest, I kind of love this scene. It's so ridiculously stupid, breaks every single piece of lore the show had established about Time Lords up to that point, and would be rendered even more nonsensical retroactively, and the jokes are so deeply and utterly unfunny to their core, that they actually end up coming all the way around and becoming funny again. The absurdity of K9 getting laryngitis is just the tip of the iceberg. The changing of the bodies without any explanation at all, completely in contradiction to everything we know about regeneration, is honestly just so funny and how stupid it is, it defies explanation. I think a sign of how fucking anal fans of the show can be was the short story or whatever it was that tried to explain the scene as the TARDIS pretending to be Romana or something. Why are you trying to give a logical explanation to something that defies any kind of logical explanation? It's so stupid, but unlike when New Who is usually stupid, it's stupid with so much charm that it manages to just be endearing. As for the rest of Romana's character, she does sometimes feel a bit bland and flat, which is understandable given they were writing this early in the process of Ward coming into the role. She has her moments though, a bit I do like when she's captured by the Daleks early in the story. She feigns the scared damsel, and Ward does a brilliant job to make it seem just believable enough that the Daleks following it for it would be plausible, but just fake enough so that the audience understands she's putting it on. And the way she goes in and out that mode as these scenes go on, depending on if there are any Daleks around, works really well. It shows how smart and resourceful she really is, and that she has also learned from the Doctor. In this case, the art of obfuscation. Ward's chemistry with Baker is immediately apparent, and they become such a memorable double act despite the quality of their stories frequently leaving much to be desired. It is a testament to how well they work together. So while it's not a huge introductory story for the second Romana, it's a solid one that doesn't waste the character. That leaves the supporting characters, who are a bunch of cardboard cutouts. Only Tyson matters, played by the deaf Tim Barlow. Remember when I mentioned the deaf actor in the last review? Well, this is now the time to mention that. Barlow does his best in making the performance likeable, but Tyson is just a bog-standard nation archetype who has little character. He's the stalker who turns out to be a completely friendly guy that appears in basically every nation story one way or another, and the ally who will stand next to the Doctor and or companion and support their argument or whatever. It's a bit yawn. Other than that, there's only really the prisoners, who are cutouts, and the Movellans, who, while I do get they have to be the way they are in order to portray them as cold, motionless, logical beings, it's nevertheless unfortunate how little personality any of them have. It was a fine line to walk, I concede, but is ultimately a disappointment. And that's about it for the supporting characters. Finally, there's the plot and structure, and this is probably the story's weakest element. It's unfortunately a poster child for the weaker nation products, and there are several reasons why. The pacing is piss poor, the entire first episode is just wandering around, taking on all the future plot points, and giving slow, dry, and unnatural exposition as they do it. The whole story just feels slow and eventless, nothing is actually happening most of the time, just discussing things, a plot event or change happens, then more discussing that particular event and or change. It doesn't help that because the plot feels so thin, everything just feels like we're wasting time in catching up with it. The story's odd structure does not help at all, where the quite haphazard nature of how everything is put together makes it feel both slow and dull, and quite bizarre at the same time. Scenes just coming along where there's a tiny bit of exposition or a minor happening, then cutting away. The dialogue is of course terrible because it's Terry Nation, and if you can give Stephen Moffat a run for his money in the worst Who dialogue competition. Some particular favourites of mine in part 1 where we see something happen, and then the Doctor and Romana basically just narrate what had just happened for us. But mostly it's just the pacing. Some of the plot can be good, but it just feels so thin. There's nothing like enough to fill out 4 episodes here. If some of the supporting characters had proper arcs, or if there was more of an exploration of the Movellans, then maybe it would have been more effective, but because there are only really 2 plots, and interconnected ones at that, Logic and Davros, the first half of the story feels like just an endlessly slow journey to get to these 2 plots, while the back half of the story is just playing out those 2 plots which clearly cannot sustain even that amount of time. One is boring, the other is simply frustrating. The story's biggest problem, and recurring one it has, is it's simply not interested in expanding and exploring its admittedly interesting ideas. And the ideas on their own is simply not enough to fill up the running time, which unfortunately at best leads to pointless diversions, and at worst leads to long, boring, and dull emptiness. Oh, and quickly, the tone is a problem as well. Adam's propensity for jokes can work, but it needs to be woven into the tapestry of the story like with City of Death. This story can help but feel even more confused when the infusion of comedy is in the same breath pretty much as the Daleks executing prisoners to force the Doc to comply. It's not even so much as tonal whiplash, just that the overall tone feels so muddled and confused it's difficult to know what the story even wants to be as a result, and, well, does that not say much on its own? So, Destiny of the Daleks is a curiosity, I think. Not actually even that bad, to be honest. It has some interesting ideas, good character work for our leads. It's certainly harmless. I was ever pissed off while watching it, which sounds like damning with faint praise, but given how many of the new Who Dalek stories are going to go, it's a blessing we should savour. Its problems stem from feeling like it's confused and muddled without any grip on its ideas, plots or tone, and from woefully underdeveloping most of its important beats. Bringing Davros back was a mistake from the word go. Bringing him back and doing so little of interest from him was the unforgivable mistake. This story therefore remains a bit of a bizarre entry into the show's canon. Not one without merit or enjoyment, but one that never really felt like it had much promise to begin with, and didn't really manage to live up to even that promise. Therefore, I'm awarding this story a final score of 4 out of 10. I put it slightly below average for classic Who. Not exactly bad per se, with some ideas and portrayals worth praising, but mostly comes out as a confused, dull mess without much identity. It manages to put together a somewhat watchable 100 minutes of television, but does so without managing to get the viewer invested or interested, as well as the classic series usually does. Thus, slightly below average. So, now it's time for me this video to end and me to spack off, but fear not, I'll be back in 2 weeks as regularly scheduled for some Doctor Who of some kind. I haven't really decided yet.